King George III, the mind of a king. You might picture it as a fortress, a place of supreme command, of unshakable certainty. But a mind, even a real one, is not made of stone. It is a far more delicate and mysterious country. It has its own hidden landscapes, its own unpredictable weather. And for King George III, a storm was gathering on the horizon of his own consciousness, a storm that would rage for decades, leaving a kingdom in confusion and a man utterly lost at sea. We remember him as the tyrant from whom the American colonies broke free, the stubborn monarch who lost an empire. But that is such a simple, two-dimensional portrait. The truth, as it so often is infinitely more complex and far, far more tragic. The story of George III's madness is not one of a monster's descent. It is the story of a good man's quiet, terrifying disintegration. In the beginning, he was everything a nation could want. Pious, diligent, a devoted husband to his Queen Charlotte, and a father to 15 children. He was a man of simple tastes, preferring a quiet family life to the debauched excesses of his predecessors. They called him Farmer George for his passion for agriculture, his genuine interest in the land. He was stable, he was predictable. Until he wasn't. The first true tremor struck in the summer of 1888. The king, at 50 years old, began to change. His speech, normally so measured, became a torrent, a relentless flood of words that would flow for hours until his voice grew hoarse and foam flecked his lips. He would weep uncontrollably, then erupt into fits of violent rage, throwing objects, pinning his own terrified sons to the wall. He developed obsessions, fixating on the trivial, writing letters and dispatches that stretched for hundreds of pages, his handwriting devolving from a neat script into a frantic, illegible scrawl, a mind losing its anchor. His doctors, products of an age that understood the brain as a crude machine of humors and vapors, were utterly baffled. So they subjected him to the brutal medical tortures of the day. He was bled with leeches, purged with emetics, blistered with caustic powders, all in a desperate attempt to rebalance his supposed humors. His legs were swaddled in poultices, so corrosive they left him with permanent scars. When he became agitated, he was restrained in a straitjacket and strapped to a chair for hours on end, a king reduced to a prisoner in his own palace. The very men tasked with his care became his tormentors. And then there were the delusions, the fantasy world that became his reality. He became convinced that London was flooded, that he could see the waters of the Thames rising to the windows of Kew Palace. He would hold conversations with the dead, most notably with his youngest children, Octavius and Alfred, who had died in infancy years before. He claimed he could speak to angels. Perhaps most bizarrely, he fell deeply and passionately in love with a woman he had never met, a lady-in-waiting to the Queen named Lady Elizabeth Pembroke. He would write her obsessive, rambling love letters. During his bouts of delirium, he would declare his intention to divorce Queen Charlotte and make Lady Pembroke his new bride. Imagine the quiet agony of the Queen, forced to stand by and watch the man she loved, the father of her children, lose himself in a fantasy where she was no longer his beloved. What was the cause of this royal malady? For centuries, the accepted theory was porphyria, a rare genetic blood disorder whose symptoms can include confusion and hallucinations. A neat, tidy explanation. But modern analysis, looking back at the detailed records of his doctors, suggests something perhaps more familiar, more human. It's now believed the king suffered from severe bipolar disorder. His periods of frantic, manic energy followed by deep, immobilizing depressions fit the pattern perfectly. The so-called treatments he endured, the stress of losing America, the pressures of the crown, all of it likely a toxic fuel poured on the fire of his underlying condition, pushing him further and further into the abyss. The final descent was the most heartbreaking. After the death of his beloved youngest daughter, Princess Amelia, in 1810, the king's mind shattered for the last time. It never recovered. For the final decade of his life, he was a ghost haunting the halls of Windsor Castle, blind, deaf, with a long white beard that flowed down his chest.
He would wander the rooms in his nightgown, playing his harpsichord for hours on end, singing and talking to people who were no longer there. He was a king who held no power, a father who did not recognize his children, a man who had outlived his own mind. The storm had finally passed, but it had washed away everything, leaving only a hollow, echoing silence, a profound and unsettling reminder that the crown offers no protection from the frailties of the human mind. Majesty is in the end just a costume, and beneath it there is only a person, as vulnerable as any of us to the darkness that can gather within. And it was this man's son who was next in line to the throne, a son who saw his father's internal chaos and chose to create an external one, all his own.
George, Prince of Wales. If King George III was a man defined by duty and undone by disease, his eldest son was a man defined by indulgence and almost undone by his own appetites. George, the Prince of Wales, later Prince Regent, and finally King George IV, was a walking, breathing monument to excess. He was a man who turned personal pleasure into an art form and debt into a national crisis. From a young age, it was clear that Prinny, as he was known, was the polar opposite of his frugal, pious father. Where the king was restrained, the prince was flamboyant. Where the king was faithful, the prince was a serial philanderer. He was handsome, witty, and possessed of an undeniable charm that he wielded like a weapon. He became the leader of a fashionable, decadent set, a cirque of aristocrats dedicated to gambling, drinking, and high fashion. He was, in essence, the first celebrity royal, and the public was both fascinated and appalled by him. His greatest talent and his most ruinous vice was his taste. He had an exquisite eye for art, architecture, and design. He commissioned the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, a fantastical seaside palace that looked as though it had been plucked from a dream of India, with its domes, minarets, and opulent dragon-filled interiors. He transformed Buckingham House into the palace we know today. He was a patron of the arts, a connoisseur of fine furniture, and a revolutionary in the world of men's fashion, popularizing the tailored, elegant style that would become the hallmark of the Regency era. But this taste came at a staggering cost. He spent fortunes on clothes, on jewels, on art, on horses, on parties that lasted for days. He once commissioned a waistcoat so heavily embroidered with diamonds that it was valued at over £5 million in today's money. By the time he was in his early 20s, his debts were already astronomical, reaching the modern equivalent of tens of millions of pounds. Parliament was repeatedly forced to bail him out, much to the fury of the tax-paying public and the despair of his father. Yet his financial recklessness was perhaps the least of his scandals. The greatest crisis of his young life revolved around a woman his father would never, ever approve of. Her name was Maria Fitzherbert. She was a commoner, a widow twice over, and most damningly of all, a devout Roman Catholic. For the heir to the throne of a staunchly Protestant nation, a relationship with her was not just unadvisable, it was political dynamite. Under the Royal Marriages Act, any marriage the prince entered into without the king's consent was legally void. Furthermore, the Act of Settlement explicitly barred anyone who married a Catholic from ascending to the throne. But the prince was besotted. He pursued Maria relentlessly. When she resisted, he staged a dramatic suicide attempt, stabbing himself superficially and sending her a blood-smeared letter. Finally, she relented. In 1785, in a secret ceremony in her drawing room, they were married. Legally, the marriage meant nothing. Politically, it meant everything. It was an act of treasonous defiance. For the rest of their lives, their relationship was an open secret, a source of endless gossip and political instability. The prince was forced to lie to Parliament, denying the marriage to secure another bailout. Maria, a woman of principle, was placed in the humiliating position of being his wife in the eyes of God, but only his mistress in the eyes of the state. The farce became a tragedy when in 1795 the prince was finally forced by his father and the government to make a suitable, politically advantageous marriage. His bride was his first cousin, Caroline of Brunswick. He had never met her. From the moment he laid eyes on her, he was repulsed. He found her coarse, loud, and unhygienic. He famously spent most of his wedding night passed out drunk in the fireplace. They performed their dynastic duty, producing a single child, a daughter named Charlotte, and then separated, living apart for the rest of their lives, locked in a state of mutual public hatred. The prince's life was a study in contradiction, a man of immense culture who possessed a profound lack of self-control, a trendsetter who grew into a bloated, grotesque caricature of his younger self, so obese he was described as a great whale, a romantic who treated the women in his life with appalling cruelty. He built monuments of breathtaking beauty, but his personal life was a ruin. He was the Prince of Pleasure, but one gets the sense, reading his letters, that he was not a happy man. His pursuit of pleasure was so frantic, so all-consuming, that it seems less like a joyful indulgence and more like a desperate flight from a deep and abiding emptiness. He was a king of surfaces, of beautiful, glittering things, but beneath the gilt and the glamour, there was a hollowness that all the wine and women and palaces in the world could never quite fill. And his choice of bride, the woman he so publicly despised, would come back to haunt him and the nation.
Queen Caroline. History is rarely kind to women who refuse to play by its rules, and few women in royal history broke more rules more publicly and more defiantly than Caroline of Brunswick, the despised and rejected wife of George IV. Her story is not a quiet tragedy played out behind palace walls. It is a loud, messy, and often deeply uncomfortable public spectacle, a battle for popular opinion waged in the streets and in the press. From the very beginning, the marriage was a disaster. She was a German princess, chosen for her bloodline, not her personality. She was boisterous, undignified, and had a questionable sense of personal hygiene. The fastidious, image-obsessed prince was horrified. He, in turn, was a drunken, self-pitying narcissist, still in love with his secret Catholic wife. It was a match made in hell, and it combusted on contact. After the birth of their daughter Charlotte, they separated. Caroline was banished from court, cast into a strange royal limbo. She was the Princess of Wales, the future Queen of England, yet she was an outcast, living a separate life. It was in this exile that her true eccentric nature began to flourish. She hosted raucous parties, wore revealing and outlandish clothes, and spoke with a frankness that constantly shocked polite society. Her husband, meanwhile, became obsessed with divorcing her. But divorce required an act of parliament and proof of adultery, so he set his spies on her. He was determined to catch her, to gather the evidence he needed to be rid of her forever. This campaign of surveillance became known as the Delicate Investigation. It found plenty of evidence of Caroline's indiscretion and recklessness, but no definitive proof of adultery. The investigation failed, and Caroline, for the time being, was safe. Emboldened and disgusted with her life in England, she decided to leave. In 1814, she embarked on a years-long tour of Europe and the Mediterranean, a journey that would become the stuff of legend. She traveled with a bizarre and motley entourage, including a handsome Italian courtier named Bartolome Pergami. She elevated Pergami from a servant to the head of her household, showering him and his family with gifts and titles. They were inseparable. They slept in adjoining tents. They bathed together. She was seen in public sitting on his lap. Whether they were lovers is a question historians still debate, but to the outside world, their relationship was a scandalous and undeniable affair. The real crisis came in 1820. Her father-in-law, the mad King George III, finally died.
Her husband, the Prince Regent, ascended the throne as King George IV, and Caroline, by law, was now Queen of the United Kingdom. George was apoplectic. The idea of this woman, his nemesis, being crowned alongside him was more than he could bear. He offered her a massive annual income to stay out of the country and renounce the title of queen. It was a bribe, and Caroline, to the shock of everyone, refused it. She decided to return to England to claim her rights. Her return was a sensation. The common people, who despised the extravagant and selfish new king, saw Caroline as a victim, a wronged woman fighting for her rights against a corrupt and powerful establishment. They rallied to her cause. "God save the Queen," they shouted, as her carriage made its way through the cheering crowds of London. She became an unlikely folk hero, a symbol of defiance against a hated monarch. Her husband, meanwhile, became obsessed with divorcing her. But divorce required an act of parliament and proof of adultery, so he set his spies on her. He was determined to catch her, to gather the evidence he needed to be rid of her forever. This campaign of surveillance became known as the Delicate Investigation. It found plenty of evidence of Caroline's indiscretion and recklessness, but no definitive proof of adultery. The investigation failed, and Caroline, for the time being, was safe. Emboldened and disgusted with her life in England, she decided to leave. In 1814, she embarked on a years-long tour of Europe and the Mediterranean, a journey that would become the stuff of legend. She traveled with a bizarre and motley entourage, including a handsome Italian courtier named Bartolome Pregami. She elevated Pregami from a servant to the head of her household, showering him and his family with gifts and titles. They were inseparable. They slept in adjoining tents. They bathed together. She was seen in public sitting on his lap. Whether they were lovers is a question historians still debate, but to the outside world, their relationship was a scandalous and undeniable affair. The real crisis came in 1820. Her father-in-law, the mad King George III, finally died. Her husband, the Prince Regent, ascended the throne as King George IV, and Caroline, by law, was now Queen of the United Kingdom. George was apoplectic. The idea of this woman, his nemesis, being crowned alongside him was more than he could bear. He offered her a massive annual income to stay out of the country and renounce the title of queen. It was a bribe, and Caroline, to the shock of everyone, refused it. She decided to return to England to claim her rights. Her return was a sensation. The common people, who despised the extravagant and selfish new king, saw Caroline as a victim, a wronged woman fighting for her rights against a corrupt and powerful establishment. They rallied to her cause. "God save the Queen," they shouted, as her carriage made its way through the cheering crowds of London. She became an unlikely folk hero, a symbol of defiance against a hated monarch. The king, enraged, decided to play his final card. He introduced a bill in the House of Lords, the Pains and Penalties Bill, which would grant him his divorce and strip Caroline of her title on the grounds of adultery. This set the stage for one of the most extraordinary and surreal episodes in British legal history, the public trial of a queen. For 51 days, the House of Lords was transformed into a courtroom. Italian servants were brought over to give lurid, often comical testimony about what they had seen through keyholes and in bathhouses. The intimate details of the Queen's life were laid bare for the world to see. The press had a field day. It was a national circus. In the end, the government, fearing a full-blown revolution from Caroline's passionate supporters, withdrew the bill. She had won. The people celebrated in the streets. But it was a hollow victory. She was still barred from court, still ostracized by the aristocracy. Her final act of defiance came on the day of her husband's coronation in July 1821. She was explicitly forbidden from attending, but she went anyway. She rode to Westminster Abbey and hammered on the doors, demanding to be let in, demanding to be crowned. The doors remained shut. Turned away at every entrance, humiliated and defeated, she finally retreated. It was the final blow. Just 19 days later, she fell violently ill and died. Her story is a strange and messy one. She was not a blameless victim. She was a reckless, foolish, and often undignified woman, but she was a woman of incredible spirit and courage, who refused to be silenced, who refused to be erased. In her flawed and chaotic way, she fought back against a system designed to crush her. And in doing so, she exposed the hypocrisy and cruelty at the very heart of the Georgian court. And the one true innocent in her story, her daughter, would pay the highest price.
Princess Charlotte. In the grand, chaotic theater of the Georgian royal family, there was one figure who represented a flicker of hope, a promise of a better, more stable future. Her name was Princess Charlotte of Wales, the only child of the disastrous marriage between George and Caroline, and her story is one of the great what-ifs of British history. From the moment of her birth, Charlotte was a pawn in her parents' vicious war. Her father largely ignored her. Her mother was erratic and often absent. Charlotte grew up in a gilded cage, a lonely and emotionally neglected child, starved of parental affection. But despite this bleak upbringing, she grew into a young woman of remarkable character. She was intelligent, passionate, and possessed a rebellious streak that delighted the public and terrified the court. She was headstrong. She refused to be a passive piece on the political chessboard. When her father tried to force her into a strategic marriage with the dull Prince of Orange, she flatly refused. A shocking act of defiance. She was determined to marry for love, a radical concept for a woman in her position. Her spirit made her immensely popular. The people saw in her a refreshing contrast to the decadent, selfish generation of her father and his brothers. She was their hope for the future, the woman who would one day wash away the stain of Georgian excess and restore dignity to the throne. They called her the People's Princess, long before that title would be given to another. Eventually, she found the man she wanted to marry, Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, a handsome, intelligent, but relatively minor German prince. Her father consented. Their wedding in 1816 was a joyous national event. Here at last was a royal love story that felt real. Their marriage was, by all accounts, blissfully happy. Soon, the news the entire nation had been waiting for was announced. Princess Charlotte was pregnant. The future of the monarchy seemed secure. The country held its breath. The pregnancy was difficult, but in November 1817, after more than 50 hours of grueling labor, she gave birth. The baby, a boy, was stillborn. A devastating blow, but the true tragedy was yet to come. In the hours that followed, Charlotte began to complain of stomach pains. She grew cold. She started convulsing. The doctors, who had already bled her heavily during the labor, were helpless. In the early hours of the morning, just hours after losing her son, Princess Charlotte of Wales, the hope of the nation, died. She was 21 years old. The country plunged into a state of profound and unprecedented grief. It was as if the sun had gone out. The entire nation went into mourning. Shops closed, the docks fell silent. Rich and poor alike wore black armbands. It was a spontaneous, nationwide outpouring of sorrow that stunned the establishment. People weren't just mourning a princess, they were mourning the future they had lost. They were mourning the death of hope itself. Her death created a constitutional crisis. She had been the only legitimate grandchild of King George III. Her death left a void in the line of succession. This triggered what became known as the royal baby race, a frantic scramble among George III's aging unmarried sons to find wives and produce a legitimate heir. It was this frantic race that led Charlotte's uncle, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, to marry a German princess named Victoria. A year later, they had a daughter. They named her Victoria. And so the death of one princess directly led to the birth of the queen who would come to define an entire century. A poignant twist of fate. The tragic early death of the spirited and beloved Charlotte closed the door on the chaotic Georgian era. But in doing so, it opened another, leading directly to the long, stable reign of Queen Victoria. We can only wonder what kind of queen Charlotte might have been, but in her brief life and her tragic death, she left an indelible mark, a ghost of a brighter future that haunted the end of a scandalous age. And her uncles, in their sudden rush to the altar, were not without their own skeletons in the closet.
Prince Frederick, Duke of York. While the Prince of Wales was the undisputed champion of royal scandal, he was not without competition. His younger brother, Prince Frederick, the Duke of York, managed to create a scandal so immense, so public, and so damaging that it threatened to bring down not just the royal family, but the entire British military establishment. Frederick was, by all accounts, the favorite son of King George III. Unlike his flamboyant elder brother, Frederick was a soldier. He was appointed commander-in-chief of the British Army. He was not a brilliant field commander, but he was a superb administrator. He instituted sweeping reforms that modernized the army, tackling corruption and improving conditions for the common soldier. He was known affectionately as the Grand Old Duke of York. He was respected. He was powerful. But he had a weakness. He kept a mistress. This in itself was not unusual. What was unusual was the woman he chose and the power he allowed her to wield. Her name was Marianne Clark. Marianne was not an aristocrat. She was the daughter of a stonemason, but she was beautiful, fiercely intelligent, ambitious, and possessed a razor-sharp wit. She became the Duke's mistress in 1803, and he installed her in a fashionable, lavishly furnished house in London. He showered her with money, but the Duke, like his brother, was perpetually in debt. The funds were never enough to support the opulent lifestyle Marianne craved, and so she devised a business plan. She began to use her influence, her intimate connection to the commander-in-chief, to sell military commissions and promotions. An ambitious young officer eager for a captaincy could make a visit to Marianne Clark. For a fee, a few hundred or a few £1,000s, she would whisper in the Duke's ear, and, miraculously, the promotion would be granted. It was a brazen and highly illegal scheme, a direct trade of cash for military rank, all orchestrated from her elegant drawing room. For years, the scheme worked perfectly, but Marianne grew careless. In 1809, a radical member of Parliament named William Wardle got wind of the story. He stood up in the House of Commons and formally accused the Duke of York of corruption, alleging that he had knowingly allowed his mistress to sell army commissions. The accusation was a bombshell. The government, confident in the Duke's innocence, agreed to a full parliamentary inquiry. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The inquiry became the must-see political drama of the decade, and its star witness was Marianne Clark herself. For weeks, she stood before the packed House of Commons, a lone woman facing down the most powerful men in the country. They had expected a timid, easily intimidated courtesan. Instead, they found a woman who was articulate, fearless, and utterly unflappable. She answered their questions with a mixture of shocking frankness and devastating wit, turning the tables on her interrogators time and time again. She admitted to the entire scheme, providing names, dates, and figures. She read aloud intimate letters the Duke had written to her. The solemn investigation descended into high farce and public humiliation for the royal family. The nation was captivated. The newspapers printed every word of her testimony. Crowds gathered outside Parliament to cheer for her. She became a celebrity, a folk hero. She insisted the Duke had been fully aware of her activities. The Duke denied everything, swearing on his honor as a prince that he was innocent. But the damage was done. The inquiry ultimately concluded there was no direct evidence he had personally taken money, but the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. His reputation was in tatters. He had been exposed at best as a fool duped by his clever mistress, and at worst as a liar. His position was untenable. In March 1809, Prince Frederick, the Grand Old Duke of York, resigned as commander-in-chief of the army in disgrace. It was a stunning fall from grace. And Marianne Clark? She negotiated the publication of her memoirs, which were so filled with royal secrets that the government paid her a massive sum and a lifelong pension to suppress them. She retired to a comfortable life in Paris, the stonemason's daughter, who had single-handedly brought down the king's favorite son. The affair stands as a perfect monument to the Georgian era, a collision of military duty and personal desire, of public honor and private vice, where the secrets of the bedroom could explode into a scandal that shook the very foundations of the state.